Welcome to the Talking Michigan Transportation Podcast. I'm Jeff Cranston. With budget talks continuing here in Michigan, but broad agreement that the transportation component will involve a long-discussed proposal to remove the 6% sales tax on fuel, I'm resurrecting a discussion about polling on that concept from more than a year ago. The conversation with pollster Bernie Porn of the Lansing firm EPIC-MRA also included insights from polling over the years on other perceptions surrounding funding and building roads. What he had to say then about the public's view on not having anything they pay on sales tax on fuel go to roads is interesting, especially today. The budget that's making its way through to final approval now calls for backfilling those benefactors of the sales tax on fuel. That includes the school aid fund and some revenue sharing to local communities. And instead, since none of that sales tax went to roads, they will raise the fuel tax by a comparable amount to what that sales tax brought in, and that money will go to roads. So I hope you find the conversation interesting. So once again, I'm with Bernie Porn, who is the principal at EPIC-MRA, veteran pollster in the state of Michigan. He's been at this a long time and has experience in the legislature. So when he talks about his polling data, he can talk about what happens recently in the snapshot in time, but he also brings tremendous context and perspective from somebody who's been looking at public policy in Michigan for a long time. I don't want to date you too much, Bernie, but why don't you talk about how many years you've been doing this?
Since trees were new.
Yes. And then the dinosaurs came.
Yes. I think the first poll I did was when I was in college in 1972.
You were at Aquinas College with some friends of mine, as a matter of fact.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So let's talk about the findings of this most recent poll. I think it's not surprising that people who already assumed that everything they pay at the pump was going to roads would say that it should. But and asked that simple way in a vacuum, most people would say, well, yeah. But then when you start explaining where that 6% sales tax that Michigan charges on fuel goes, a lot of very important things, schools chief among them, but certainly some of that goes to revenue sharing. And a small sliver actually does go to transportation in terms of the Comprehensive Transportation Fund, which funds transit, for instance, doesn't necessarily go to roads and bridges. But this gets complicated in a hurry, like everything with public policy. So I don't know. Why don't you just give me the top lines of your findings?
Well, we asked voters, do you think that all of the taxes you pay at the gas pump should or should not go toward funding improvements to Michigan's roads and bridges? 82%, a very high number, said yes, all taxes paid should go toward funding Michigan roads and bridges. 13% said no, not all taxes should go toward funding roads and bridges, and 5% were undecided. We then explained to them that Michigan is one of only 6 states that charges a sales tax on gas, and very little of the 6% sales tax collected at the pump goes to fund improvements to Michigan roads and bridges. In fact, the 6% sales tax collected at the gas pump generates about $1.1 billion per year, but only about $50 million, or less than 5%, goes to the Comprehensive Transportation Fund that goes to roads and bridges. Just under $800 million goes to the school aid fund. Just over $100 million goes to local revenue sharing, and another $130 million goes to the state general fund. Would you favor or oppose legislation that would require all of the $1.1 billion in funds collected from the 6% sales tax to go toward funding improvements to roads and bridges? And that number is lower than the 82%, obviously. 66% would favor such legislation, 38% strongly, and 25% would oppose it, 11% strongly, with 9% undecided. That is a pretty strong number. And when you look at the partisan breakdown of that number, on that question. 73% of conservatives, 66% of moderates, and a lower 53% of liberals say they would support it. And by party, 58% of Democrats, 64% of independent voters, and 75% of Republicans say that they would support having all of the 6% sales tax going to transportation. And, there's a lot of other demographic breakouts that I could go over, but in a nutshell, I think the political party is probably the most important one, because that is what, if in fact there's an attempt to push this proposal, that will be what the legislators will be looking at.
You think, having done this for a long time and, working with lawmakers and working with various advocacy groups on your polling, is there any way to simplify this? I mean, Prop A in 1994 was framed in a way, I think, that was pretty simple for people to get their brains around. Prop 1 in 2015, while described by someone as conservative as Rob Fowler, who was then with the Small Business Association of Michigan, as a very elegant proposal, had support from both sides, yet it didn't even get 20% in the November vote that year. Do you think there's a way? I mean, and I think that, and you can tell me what you think. I think even though it did a lot and it would have solved a lot of public policy problems in Michigan, it was just too complicated. And anytime something's complicated, it makes it easy for the opposition to blow it apart. Is there any way to get this through to people?
I think if you simply state that 6% sales tax is charged on tax or on gasoline at the pump, and this proposal A or whatever it would be, actually it could be done, could it not, by just the legislature, or would it have to go on the ballot?
Well, I think it could.
If it can be done just by the legislature, all of the proposed legislation would take all of the $1.1 billion raised from the 6% sales tax and devote it to transportation. However, I do think that legislatively you would need to append that by saying previously a great deal went to education and also revenue sharing, and there's going to have to be some accommodation in terms of other sources of revenue to meet the needs of education and also revenue sharing, because I think you will end up with some pretty powerful interests that will suggest they're not in favor of all of the money going to transportation.
Well, yeah, and I mean that's the problem from a public policy standpoint. A long time ago, and I'm sure that this goes on in various forms in other states, but somehow we pitted roads against schools for funding, and they're all part of basic infrastructure, right? Our education system and what we do to grow youths and grow education. It's the same as the vital importance of how we get from A to B and how we live, work, and play. Transportation is part of that. And that was the beauty of, I think, Proposal 1 in 2015. It did not harm the schools. It raised more money overall. Ultimately, it was going to cost people more, but it was also going to deliver a lot more. And again, it was easy to blow it apart because it was complicated. So it sounds like you're saying that you think, based on your findings, you think there could be some bipartisan support for doing this and doing it in a way that holds schools and communities that get revenue sharing harmless?
Well, I think there is. And one of the things that I would love to see the legislature pursue, and of course, you're going to have opposition from business and probably many Republicans, and that is a graduated income tax, much like Minnesota has. If you were to take that same proposal and implant it in Michigan with percentages going from just under 10% for people making over $1 million and dropping it down to less than the 4% for those with the lowest income. where a vast majority of people would pay less on a graduated income tax, but it would raise, I think, between $4 and $5 billion. You would then be able to provide the funding needed for education, not only holding them harmless, but providing more funding for not only education, but also transportation. And I think the revenue sharing could be held harmless and possibly even an increase. And by the way, we have tested that many times, and it is supported by voters to the tune of in the neighborhood of 65%.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, again, given your vast history with this and knowing that you talk to people and study issues in other states, why do you think this is so difficult in Michigan?
Well, for one thing, the proposal in 2015, that was such a hodgepodge of changes and transfers and switching this for that and so much else that I know that the media folks who were working on it, doing focus groups, they had a tough time even selling it in focus groups where you could explain it and show pictures and everything else. And when we tested it in our polling, it never broke like 30%. And I knew that it was going to be beaten by even more than that. And sure enough, in a survey we did at the time for Kalamazoo-Risa, they were testing a special ed millage proposal, and we tested that where 65+% supported the special ed millage, and then the superintendent of K-Risa said, with this on the ballot that the governor placed on the ballot, proposal whatever 8A or number 1 in 2015, can that have an impact? I said it sure can, and we tested it, and it showed that almost 80% were going to vote against it, which is in fact what happened, and only 51% would vote for the special ed millage, which is where it ended up in K-Risa. It is a complicated issue, but I think if you simplify it as much as possible, saying changing from a division of how the 6% is divvied up to all of it going to transportation, $1.1 billion, and the other interest held harmless by getting revenue from other sources. I think that would be a good approach to try and sell it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, first of all, yeah, the complications of the 2015 proposal, I remember well. I participated in a number of discussions and media events and presentations to try to explain it, try to just explain, not advocate one way or the other, but just explain it because people had a lot of questions. And, you know, it might have done something just to educate people about how roads are funded in Michigan, although I still see all the time stories and various, you know, online associations that track things, that track taxes in various states, and it'll show Michigan among the highest for gas taxes. And that should always come with a big old asterisk, because if you don't include the sales tax, Michigan's actual gas tax is more in the middle. You know, people like to cite Ohio all the time. You know, Ohio's gas tax is 8.5 cents higher, even after Michigan passed the proposal in 2015 legislatively to phase in a minor increase in fuel taxes. Ohio went for 10 cents. So now Michigan's at about 30 and they're at 38.5, and they get $250 million a year in tolling revenue from the turnpike. And, you know, people say, well, Ohio's roads are better. Well, you know, pound for pound, they're really not. But that's the perception sometime from when you're driving and when you happen to cross the border. And maybe I-75 in Toledo happened to have been worked on last year, and I-75 in Monroe County hadn't been worked on for 30 years. So you just think that their roads must be better, but they'll tell you that they have a lot of challenges too. This gets difficult because people want to look for any excuse to not pay more, and legislators don't want to have to vote for that. The governor tried really diligently, you know, went across the state explaining the problem, especially with looking at crumbling bridges, and couldn't get anything moved. And so she did what she could, at least for the state trunk lines that are under her jurisdiction, by doing the bonding, which is definitely making a dent, especially in the highest traveled roads. There's not a lot that we can do at the state level for the local roads. MDOT helps local agencies with the bridge bundling and other assistance that they can provide. But getting a comprehensive solution like you're talking about that would help, all local roads, city, village, county, and state trunk lines, I just think it would be a huge thing for our tourism industry and for so many businesses that talk about, the difficulty in attracting new business.
That would attract, I think, a lot of new business, and if it was part of a comprehensive business attraction plan, I think it would be well worth it. However, you cannot leave education nor revenue sharing out and take money away from them. So I think that needs to be part of the equation in terms of finding more money. And a good approach to do that would be going to a graduated income tax as one approach. Other than that, you could probably raise sales tax, but you then get into I think more difficulty selling that to Democrats, and even putting all of this money, $1.1 billion of the sales tax into transportation. There is less support among Democrats than there are among independents, and certainly less than there is among Republican voters. But there may well be a greater reluctance to do that among Republican legislators than either Democrats or those that are in competitive districts.
Yeah, the regressive nature of the sales tax is always going to be a problem for some lawmakers. But I think you make a good point about how this all has to be balanced. I wondered about your findings, too, whether we've made a dent at all in helping people to understand that the reason that roads have been so challenged in our state for a long time aren't because anybody's doing anything wrong. The contractors, the various road agencies that offer the contracts and work on designing these things follow national specs. The Federal Highway Administration has, their own policies and procedures. There's an association, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, that set these rules, and everybody's doing basically the same thing with the same kind of materials. It's just about how much you invest. Michigan has become a national leader in what's called asset management, meaning tackling the system and repairs from a scientific standpoint, using data to inform decisions, not just because they're innovative thinkers, but because they had to do something to make the money go further, because there just isn't enough of it. So what did you find about that in terms of people's perceptions of how roads are maintained?
Well, we have on a number of occasions tested perception of condition of the roads, and we haven't done it probably in the last year and a half or so, but it has been rather negative. I mean, at one point it was like 94% negative rating, but it has been improving. And not long ago, we did some testing as to whether or not people preferred blacktop or preferred cement, and they fairly convincingly preferred blacktop, and however, they thought it would not last as long. But I knew at the time that if you prepare where you're going to lay new materials for roads, that if you properly do the setup for the blacktop, that can work very well.
That's interesting. When you say blacktop, that's, to people in the industry, they're thinking of that as asphalt or hot mix asphalt. We call it HMA. And cement is what is in concrete. So it's usually thought of, and, I probably have been at this long enough now that I know some of these things that I didn't used to know as a journalist. But the concrete versus asphalt debate is a heavy one, and it's an important competition in order to keep prices down, that we need all the industries to be healthy. Do you get any sense of why people said that they think that asphalt or blacktop is better than concrete?
I think a lot of it has to do with not understanding what are state and what are local roads. that a lot of communities have not done all that well in terms of maintaining local roads. And if there is an area where that is occurring, and most of your driving is on local roads and not that much on state roads, you tend to view the pavements negatively, and so I think that that's a big part of the equation, how it is perceived, because a lot of people don't think, oh, this is a local road, and it's not as well built as a state road that I go on maybe a couple times a week.
That's interesting too, because you said, I think part of that, even if they thought one lasted longer than the other, in other words, you get more bang for your buck, they still feel like one is better in the short term in terms of just their driving experience. Is that basically what you found?
Yeah, people thought that blacktop or asphalt was smoother riding. It was better in bad weather, whereas cement was more lasting in terms of road construction, but they didn't like driving on it as much.
We'll be right back. Stay tuned.
The Michigan Department of Transportation reminds you that when a vehicle collides with another vehicle, person, or other object, it is a crash, not an accident. By reducing human error, we can prevent crashes and rebuild Michigan roads safely.
Peter Taylor, who is a PhD that heads up National Concrete Institute at Iowa State University, and somebody I've talked to frequently about these issues, would definitely beg to differ and would talk a great deal about, really well-made concrete and how long it can last and how resilient it can be. So this is a debate that will probably never be settled. That's for sure. Well, bringing this back home, are you optimistic at all, knowing that we still have very divided government, very, very close in both the House and the Senate? The Democrats have control. Actually, it's tied now in the House. Do you have any faith that something could happen over these? Really, in this year, I guess, perhaps in lame duck. What's your? I don't know. If you had to bet, what would you say?
I would probably say that it is unlikely, because there are other issues that may well be more critical to deal with than transportation. Plus, I think there's an awareness that there is federal funding that is available or still coming in. I think over the next 5 years, 4 years, 5 years, in terms of funding for transportation.
Yeah, the IIJA, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
And is that somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 or $7 billion, I think?
Yeah, for Michigan, it's definitely helping, especially at the local level. A lot of that money was reauthorization. These reauthorizations happen every few years under different acronyms. It's all helpful, but it would certainly be setting false expectations to think that at all was enough money to solve, Michigan's problems, which are decades in the making.
No, it's enormous in terms of the need to provide funding for road construction. But I really think that a part of that it has to be enough so that local roads can be a part of the solution, because you will continue to have that negative perception if most people are driving on local roads and not all communities are maintaining them as well as they can. And we have tested local roads, perception of local roads in a lot of communities, and they will vary from 90% negative to 70% positive in some communities. And we have, in some communities, had it as high as 70%. One was my hometown of Flushing, where a few years ago where we did a survey.
Well, and as you know, in this most recent election, on primary day, there were a handful of local roads issues on the ballot across the state.
Yes.
And most of them did well. And I think The city of Grand Rapids in 2014 overwhelmingly passed an income tax for streets, and the leaders at the time in the city of Grand Rapids were very aggressive about getting that money on the street, so a lot of that work was going on right away so people could see it. I think it would probably pass again because people get it when you can actually see the work going on. And I think that's the case with the Rebuilding Michigan bonding program and the amount of work that's been going on the last few years. I mean, you can't have it both ways, right? You can't complain that the roads are crumbling and then complain because they're fixing too many. So that's a balance too.
Yeah, and people will complain because they take longer to get to work for a few months because there's a one lane on a particular highway, which is about to take place, I think, on a portion near Lansing on 96. So that kind of perception is always going to be there, where people will complain about having only one lane to drive on a highway. But at some point, it ends, and then all of a sudden they have a wonderful pavement to drive on.
That's right, yeah. Well, Bernie, thank you. As always, I really appreciate your insights and appreciate what you do to help various organizations and policymakers understand what the citizens are thinking and, what they want. So we'll have to talk again sometime.
Love to do it anytime, Jeff.
I'd like to thank you once more for tuning in to Talking Michigan Transportation. You can find show notes and more on Apple Podcasts or Buzzsprout. I also want to acknowledge the talented people who help make this a reality each week, starting with Randy Debler, who skillfully edits the audio, Jesse Ball, who proofs the content, Courtney Bates, who posts the podcast to various platforms, and Jackie Salinas, who transcribes the audio to make it accessible to all.